as we welcome in TSN Hockey Insider, the co-host of the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast, Mr. Darren Dreger. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I have some technical issues here in the old home studio, but yeah,
we can see you. It's all
Look
good.
okay,
Yeah.
sound okay.
Yeah.
Let's get this in before it all goes to pot. Dregs Nils Höglander, how much is he on the block here?
Well, again, it's always a game of semantics, isn't it? When you talk about players being on the block, are they being shopped? There's a difference, and I can appreciate that from a management perspective. Teams call all the time on certain players. That doesn't necessarily mean that that player is available or that the Vancouver Canucks want to trade this guy. But I would say that there's a good level of interest in Höglander, but nothing that has reached a front burner category at this point. So we'll wait and see. But, historically, as we know, the Vancouver Canucks under the leadership of Jim Rutherford and Patrick Galvin aren't afraid to jump in early if there's something that makes some sense. So it's also early, but if the interest picks up in Höglander, then maybe you do see something. But I didn't get the sense earlier today that there was anything close.
The Canucks have to be ecstatic that they're winning, though, because Patrick Galvin and company now do not appear desperate. The GMs on the other end don't have to snicker when the number shows up on call display now. This has given them a little bit of a buffer to conduct relatively normal business, right?
Yeah, I think so. And again, it's also sort of normal for where we're at in regular season, be it with the Vancouver Canucks or any team across the league. I get the same feedback from GMs. I had an exchange with Steve Staios, the Ottawa Senators, going into their game against the Anaheim Ducks last night. And there's a growing sense in the nation's capital that Staios is going to have to do something. And I'm like, well, are you feeling that sense of urgency based on level of play of late? And he's like, no, I mean, we're doing what we do as GMs. We're making the calls. We're taking calls. And, of course, if there's a fit, then we're going to be active and we're going to strike when there's opportunity. I think that's Patrick Galvin. I look at Ottawa and I look at Vancouver and I look at a lot of teams around the National Hockey League guys, and I see the appetite for added depth on the back end. And by depth, if you can get a 4, 5, 6 guy, well, that's more than depth. I think that's the market that a lot of these teams are diving into right now. But I think I checked this morning, 15 teams are caught across the National Hockey League between a 6-point spread. So you're talking about 9th overall in the National Hockey League, all the way down to the Pittsburgh Penguins, who sit, as we have this conversation, 24th. And there's only a 6-point gap. So who's giving up anything of significance if you're in that group of 15? Probably no one. Yet all those teams want to get better so that they can get on a bit of a run and they can make a playoff push a reality.
Dregs, Philip Hronek, it sounds like he's looking around, getting different opinions on what appears to be an injured shoulder. What do you know there?
Yeah, all I know is that he's either scheduled or he is going to see a specialist in the very near future. And then that'll determine both what, the prognosis is from an immediate perspective and then longer term. What are we talking about here in rehab and recovery? Until he sees that specialist or specialists, then they're not going to know for sure as to what the best remedy is, what the best approach is. But that doesn't change the timeline here. It doesn't, at least as, again, we're having this conversation Monday morning. He's still very much week to week. So I think they've pinpointed somebody to take a good look at him and somebody that they'll trust as the best interests of Hronek in mind, but we don't know exactly what that is in terms of the full extent of the injury or whether or not surgery is being suggested, any of that. He's waiting for further reporting.
Could you argue that the two ideal scenarios are maybe the ones at the other ends of the spectrum here for the Vancouver Canucks? That either you find a doctor that feels like they can do this, that, and the other and get him back in 3 to 4 weeks, or you find a guy that says, listen, put him under the knife. This will make him right as rain, but he's going to be gone for 3 months. And you LTIR him, and he drops back in for game 1 of the playoffs, something like that. I mean, are those the, anything in between is sort of middling and kind of puts the Canucks into a predicament.
Yeah, but you're talking old school here, Blake, and it's not like that doesn't happen anymore. It very much depends on what the player wants to do here. If it's something that just needs a little bit of time to settle and potentially can more or less heal on its own, or heal to a place where you can deal with the discomfort, and then it's something you address in the off season. Again, that comes down to what the wishes are of the player. But I know historically, again, that more and more players are taking action when it's time to take action. If the feeling is that surgery is the only thing that is going to rectify his situation, and whether he has it now or he has it in the off season, a lot of players will say, well, let's get it done. I'd rather get it done now, so I'm not in pain. I can go through my rehabilitation, and yeah, it'd be great if I'm ready for the playoffs. But I don't think they know that. I don't think that the player knows that. And I think that's part of why he's seeing a specialist, so that he has all of the information and then can make the decision on what's the best path for himself moving forward.
I know these are still early days, early hours, but best you can tell, this Roenick injury has not upped the urgency, or has upped the urgency for the Canucks and getting a top four defenseman.
Well, again, everybody's in that market. Not everybody, but a lot of teams are in that market. But, you know, it's just a difficult process. I don't know that they feel a higher level of urgency than they did prior to the injury. But, hey, you lose a player of this significance week to week, and unless you've got a comfort level with the backfill and what you have internally, it's a challenge, because everything is upset. Your pairings are upset. The minutes are upset in terms of how they're being consumed. And obviously, if you had an answer internally, well, that player is probably playing. He's probably in the lineup already. So, yeah, I think Patrick is going to be as aggressive as he can be, as long as it doesn't interrupt what their plan is for the future. You know, I don't get the sense that they're throwing out high-level draft picks or top prospects, you know, just to facilitate a need at this point.
For most teams, JT Miller would be, you know, an untradeable player in the minds of a head coach. This team in particular, with Rick Tocchet as the head coach, it seems absolutely unfathomable.
Agreed.
Well, reports out of Vancouver, or out of New York, pardon me, had said that the Rangers still covet bringing him back, desperate almost to get JT Miller as a blue shirt again, and that calls had been made at some point, according to Arthur Staple. I mean, is there any traction? Can you wrap your brain around that at all, given how we know Rick Tocchet talks about JT Miller?
Well, first of all, Arthur's a good reporter. He's been around this game a long, long time. He's credible, and I've heard the same. I know that I was told anyway that Chris Drury did call the Vancouver Canucks and has asked about the potential availability of JT Miller. But I also don't get the sense from my sources that the Canucks have interest in it. Now, how does that change? Can it change? Well, yeah, of course it can change. It depends on what's coming back the other way. But Chris Drury is in upheaval with the New York Rangers right now, right? I mean, that dressing room is upside down. I mean, they're a proud team. They're a proud group. You know, they're supposed to be a top contender in the Eastern Conference. And, you know, for the most part, I think it's still fair to call them that. But they've also dealt with a fair bit of adversity. And some of it of late is self-inflicted. You know, Chris Drury is still, again, I'll use the word again because it applies, in upheaval. You know, he did not see last week's round of speculation, you know, surfacing at this point of the season. You can't control what media report, but the general manager, Chris Drury, did tell his fellow general managers that those two guys specifically are in play, in Kreider and in Trouba. Well, you're talking about two very popular guys inside that room and impactful players, especially Chris Kreider. So I could also, though, understand why Chris Drury would have interest in JT Miller. How many teams, if Vancouver was open to the idea, would have interest in JT Miller? Like, come on. Every playoff team would have interest in JT Miller, because when he's firing and when he's healthy, you know, Ken Hitchcock always used to describe players like that as the head of the snake, because they do everything, and every single shift, every night, they lead you into the fight. And that's what Rick Tocchet and I think the Vancouver Canucks see in JT Miller, because on many a game last year, that's what he did. So you never say never to this possibility, but specific to New York and the conversation we're having now, I don't think the Canucks are interested in moving JT Miller.
And it's instructive because of this leave of absence, that has GMs curious. right,
Sure.
Dregs? Like they're calling
Yeah.
because they sense something amiss there and wondering if this is the window whereby JT would be available. Is that
Right.
fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And why wouldn't you? I mean, I think the Vancouver Canucks and the people that work closely with JT have done a nice job of dispelling all rumor and speculation of something more being afoot here, right? I think that the representation of why he took the leave of absence was a very honest one. The fact that he was dealing with something physically and mentally, and that's what he continues to work through. The hope, the expectation is that he's back in the lineup sooner rather than later, but there's no official timeline on that. And then you look at it from a bigger picture perspective, and you look at the family too that's impacted by all of this. So we'll see how it plays out in the long run. But again, I think the Vancouver Canucks are doing right by JT Miller, but they're doing it from a human perspective, but also doing it from a professional standpoint as well, because they recognize that they're a much better team with him healthy and firing on all cylinders in their lineup.
Lastly, Dregs, that Jiricek trade. Wow.
Sneaky.
Yeah. So Jiricek and a 5th-round pick to Minnesota for 4 draft picks and young defenseman.
The Royal Flush.
Damon Hunt. Yeah, it really was. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do you know where the Canucks were? We heard that they called Columbus on Jiricek, but do you know where the Canucks finished in that deal?
I think their interest in Jiricek was limited, to be fair. And did they call? Yeah, I'm sure they called. And I don't know that the Vancouver Canucks actually made an offer. We know that there were a number of offers that were made, and Don Waddell had to take the best one. Where it got interesting for me, and look, I think I'm pretty well connected and well connected in Minnesota, and things went quiet on Friday in Minnesota. So normally that's how you're kind of on to something. But obviously was at a point at that stage where Billy Guerin and the people of Minnesota Wild weren't close enough yet and probably had more negotiating to do. Didn't want to jinx it. There was speculation on other players, so I won't name, potentially being involved. It's a curious one. I mean, David Jiricek, for some reason, didn't fit the eye of Don Waddell, the GM of the Columbus Blue Jackets. He's 22 years old. I don't understand it. I don't understand it. And, it's not like Bill Guerin and the scouts of the Minnesota Wild aren't good quality hockey people. Of course they are. They're looking at an unused young asset and believe that the best is yet to come. We have no idea what David Jiricek is going to develop into, but it was worth a fairly decent return that Minnesota paid to acquire him. So I'm going to be intrigued to see how he's used and what he develops into in the next few years.
Absolutely. You pay that many draft picks for a player, you better hope he hits.
Yeah.
And from Columbus's point of view,
Yeah,
Weird one.
you move a player like that. Wow.
Yeah.
The ability for him to come back.
You just don't see it. You just don't see it. I mean, it's very, very strange.
Thanks, Rags. Until next Monday.
Okay, guys, have a great week.